Hello everyone, my name is Alex Krantzler. I am here to talk to you about my thesis called Speak Like You Don't Know Hebrew, Cultivating Queer Registers in Contemporary Israel. This is a linguistic anthropological study on grammatical gender in the Hebrew language. So what does grammatical gender look like in Hebrew? Imagine you are having a conversation with a friend, and you say, "Hello, how are you, male?" "I'm fine, and you, female?" "I'm feeling female terrible." Actually, this someone male banged his female car into me. Oh, poor female thing. But anyway, never mind that, I'm okay now. Do you male want to go to the female store to get some male groceries with me? Totally, let's go female. It sounds completely absurd in English, right? But this is what grammatical gender looks like in Hebrew. So like I said in the video, my motivation for this study is both personal and academic in nature. As a queer Jewish woman, I spent a lot of time trying to navigate various identities, but I never really had the time, or until recently, to look at the intersection of my own queer identity and Jewish identity and my relationship with the Hebrew language. And part of that came just the general trajectory of my life and the amount of time that I spent in different spaces. And part of that came from really just trying to learn as much as I can about as many different things as possible. And so as I went on my own questioning journey and reflected on the difficulties of finding identity language in a language like English, I really wanted to know if anyone had actually looked into what that experience was like in the Hebrew language. And so in doing research, there are really only two scholars that I could find who remotely tackled this specific issue. The first is Malka Muchnik, an Israeli linguist who chronicled the history of gender within the Hebrew language in both its biblical and modern iterations. And second is Orit Birchley, a social work scholar who did a case study of 6 non-binary Israeli young folks and looked at their experiences with language and the ways that they use the Hebrew language to perform gender. And so my research is kind of the convergence of those two. It's a little bit more technical and linguistic focus, but it does really also incorporate that human element. So before I talk about my study specifically, I'm going to give you some background in common linguistic anthropology terms. The first is an index. It's a sign that points to an object. For example, we have here a rectangle with blue, pink, and white stripes. Some of you might recognize this as the transgender pride flag. This image indexes this concept or this identity, and this concept is indicative or indexes this particular life experience of someone like Laverne Cox. Next, we have grammatical gender. About 1/4 of the world's languages have some sort of system of grammatical gender. It's a system of noun classes where they form a gendered agreement with other parts of speech. In English grammatical gender, we have a person. The person is walking their dog. Person is a woman, so she walks her dog. She and her are going to form that agreement because if you said she walks his dog, you might think we're talking about a different person's dog. In Hebrew, though, it looks a little bit different because the word walks is going to be modified or conjugated to have the female gender form, so it forms that agreement with both she and her. Lastly, we have register, which is language used for a particular purpose or in a particular context. For example, "Who's a good little baby? Look at the little baby." Right? We've all heard this before. Who am I talking to? I'm talking to a baby. This is the baby talk register. You would not talk to your boss like that. You would use a professional register. So now that I've gone over some basic terminology, I'm going to talk a little bit about what my fieldwork looked like. So I lived in central Tel Aviv for 10 weeks in the summer of 2018, from July through early September. I interviewed multilingual Hebrew speakers in English. So all of my participants were above the age of majority, which is 18 years old. They were comfortable enough speaking English fluently enough to interview in English. So I did not have any participants who only spoke Hebrew. And as such, my data is very focused on the experiences of multilingual Hebrew speakers. I also collected data through an anonymous online survey, and that was specifically focused on how are people breaking the rules of grammatical gender in written Hebrew. So when I set out on this project, I wanted to really understand 4 things. I wanted to document and identify the ways in which folks are queering the Hebrew language. I wanted to understand who are the speakers making these choices and why are they making these linguistic choices. I wanted to learn about the social consequences involved in making these choices. And I wanted to know what are the emotional and cognitive impacts of breaking the rules of the Hebrew language in this way. So I found that there are 3 overall queer registers that I'm going to be focusing on. The first is female or feminine speech. This is speaking in exclusively feminine gendered conjugations, regardless of who the audience or the person you're referring to, regardless of their gender. This is, of the 3 registers, the only one that does not index an identity specifically around someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. It indexes a political identity and a feminist identity. Next, we have gender avoidance speech. This manifests in 2 ways. The first is through tense changes or avoiding gendered self-reference. And the second is through eliminating vowels in written Hebrew. And so what that looks like in Hebrew, the vowels are kind of like these accent marks that denote pronunciation of words. So if you have the same root characters and the vowels indicate the gender, whether it's masculine or feminine, by removing those vowels, the gender of the word is open to interpretation by the reader. And that gender avoidance speech indexes a genderqueer or queer non-binary identity or affiliation with that community. Lastly, we have mixed speech, or me'orevet, which is the Hebrew word for the act of mixing. This is what one of my participants called the activist shit, saying that this is the language that the queers are using. So within me'orevet, there are 3 different strategies for doing this. The first is intrasentential, so that is within a single sentence. You're gonna have that grammatical gender mixing, or the mixing of gender forms. So that same sentence, she walks her dog, except we are gonna break the rules, and we're gonna say she walks his dog, even though it's the same person's dog. Next, we have intersentential, so this is between 2 sentences. That's where the disagreement is gonna show up. So there's gonna be agreement in that first sentence, she walks her dog, but instead of saying her dog was happy, we're gonna have his dog was happy, and that's where the disagreement shows up. Lastly, we have dual suffix speech, which this is applying both masculine and feminine gendered conjugations to a single word. This happens a lot in written Hebrew as well as spoken Hebrew. The first 2 are more common in spoken Hebrew. Dual suffix speech, we have the friends are eating, we'll say it's conjugated feminine, so the friends feminine are eating feminine. We're gonna apply both the masculine and feminine gender conjugation, so it's the friends, plural masculine, plural feminine, so like chaverimot is the, or chaverotim, and our eating is ochlimot or ochlotim, which sounds like really clunky, but it's because they're applying these double conjugations. So who are the people who are actually making these choices? So when asking one of my participants about attitudes toward folks within the LGBT community in Israel, they walked me through a hierarchy of responses to various members of the community. As you can see here, there's a lot of information, but at the top of the hierarchy we have the muscular masculine gaze who can pass as heterosexual. These are the folks who conform to the masculine gender roles, who people would look at walking down the street and not automatically assume, oh, that's a gay man. Their identities are the most recognized in society. Their voices are often receive the most amplification. It is their issues and their rights that are most frequently addressed within Israeli society. And all the way at the bottom, we have the asexual, agender, and aromantic folks, as well as the transgender people who cannot pass as cisgender, with this particular participant called the trans in the middle. Those are the folks whose voices are often silenced, their identities are unrecognized, and they are afforded the least amount of space in society. And those are the folks who are the ones who are using the me'orevet register. So why are people making these choices? There's a few different reasons why people choose to enact one of the queer registers that I talked about before. The first is along the lines of cultivating community and indexing identity. Every time someone speaks in Hebrew, I had one of my participants said, I feel like I have to come out every time I talk to someone in Hebrew, because you are gendering yourself every time you open your mouth. And so coming out by breaking the rules of the language, or by speaking in a way that is incongruent to what someone would expect you to speak, or the language that someone would expect you to use, you are outing yourself, you are marking yourself as other. Like I said before, all of my participants were multilingual, and so we talked a lot about the importing of queer language and how using code switching, so switching from Hebrew into English to avoid coming out or to avoid outing oneself, that's another form of that meta-levit register that makes speech. So I had 7 different participants bring up one poem to me over the course of my time in the field. This particular poem is by a feminist writer named Yona Wallach, and in the poem she talks about how Hebrew is a sex maniac, it wants to know who's talking. At the beginning of the poem, we see all the vowels around the Hebrew letters, and as the poem goes on, those vowels start to disappear. Now, originally I thought that that was just how the poem was written, but I actually found that these vowels were taken away as the poem was shared more and more online. So while the original poem was a commentary on the language itself, as it was circulated on the internet, the communities doing that circulation really showed a meta-pragmatic awareness, an awareness of the overall effect of linguistic choices as they circulated this poem, and really furthered what Yona Wallach was saying with her poem originally. So this clearly became a key piece of data as I looked at life beyond just literature and existing media. So in order to understand the impacts and experiences of using these registers that my participants had, I asked them, how would you best make the following sentence gender neutral? I'm eating dinner with my partner. Every single participant I asked to do this paused for a decent amount of time. They had so much difficulty translating this into Hebrew without fundamentally altering the structure of the sentence or adding a person's name in lieu of like my partner, or saying like ani ba'arochat erev, which is like I am physically at the meal, instead of like I'm eating. So they removed the actual action and switched into that passive voice, which is going to that gender avoidant language. And so when talking about the experience in trying to translate this and trying to make this sentence gender neutral in Hebrew, participants said things like, you always perceive gender, but in Hebrew you express it. In Hebrew you don't have a way out. To be inclusive, you have to be creative. They also said things like, there's no such thing as gender neutral in Hebrew, there's just adding more gender to gender. And the register has a reputation. The more you tag yourself with marked speech, in many ways that has economic consequences. To touch on those economic consequences, a lot of participants spoke of difficulty when preparing job application materials, because if you are writing a cover letter in Hebrew, you have to gender yourself. And the question of do I use the language that aligns with the identity that I was assigned, or do I use my lived language, the language that really is congruent to who I see myself and who I am as a person. And so while I was there was a huge push for helping trans and gender nonconforming folks in the Israeli LGBT community find jobs. And one of the things that the people who I interviewed who were operating that space talked about was encouraging people to submit their application materials in English, because not only did it keep them from outing themselves, but it also showed that, hey, I'm multilingual, I have an extra skill. And so that was something that I thought was really, really interesting. So what does all of this mean? What did I find? So I found that given that Hebrew is a language whose grammar requires gender marking, queer Israelis use various approaches to word choice and grammar in order to creatively index preferred gender stances, community affiliation, and political identities. And queer registers specifically cultivate a sense of community and belonging within the Israeli LGBT community, and are a form of everyday activism and resistance against the hegemonic structure of the Hebrew language. So, possible avenues for future research are looking at queer registers in other gendered languages, whether it's a language like Spanish, which doesn't have a neuter case, or a language like German, which does, or going beyond multilingualism to explore what is it like for Hebrew speakers who don't have access to a language like English, a language that has more freedom as far as gender goes. What is it like to only have Hebrew as your option as far as communicating your identity? And conversely, what is it like for native English speakers who are being socialized into the Hebrew language, who are learning a language with a much more rigid binary grammatical gender structure, so like trans and gender nonconforming English speakers learning the Hebrew language? And then looking at American English as the gay lingua franca, so globally how a lot of these queer discourses are happening in English, what does this look like and where do we go from here? So I'd like to thank my advisor, Erin Davenport, all of my participants who so graciously gave me their time, everyone who supported me throughout the course of this program, Dr. Rob Lemelson for funding this program, as well as UCLA College Honors and the Levy Center who also funded my research, my partner who put up with me leaving for 2.5 months, and my parents and everyone here for listening, and my cohort for being amazing and supporting me throughout the course of my research. So.